As you can imagine, there's not really an end to the Reformation, but if a single event can be considered something of an end to an era, then we might consider the end of the 30 Years' War and the subsequent adoption of the Peace of Westphalia as the end of the Reformation era. At the same time, though, the 30 Years' War was one in which politics was very much at the forefront, and while religious disagreement underpinned some of those politics, in other ways this war was just like what had previously occurred in France, except this one involved nearly the entirety of the European continent. After the Peace of Augsburg, the Holy Roman Emperors did not seem inclined to try and limit the spread of Lutheranism. That is, they adhered to the peace. Still, the peace had not addressed several underlying religious tensions, most notably the increasing popularity of Calvinism among some of the German nobility. These Calvinist nobles felt so marginalized that they formed the Protestant Union in 1608, to which they invited Lutheran nobles who also felt threatened by surrounding Catholic states. Or rather than pay attention to these events, the Holy Roman Emperors of the late 16th and early 17th centuries were most concerned with Ottoman campaigns in Eastern Europe and in the Balkans. In 1605, Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II's army undertook a campaign against the Turks in the Balkans. With Rudolf's attention focused elsewhere, Protestants living in Transylvania and Hungary, both officially Catholic states, took the opportunity to rebel against the emperor. A Protestant army marched into Moravia, which closely bordered the Habsburg stronghold of Vienna. Rudolf, who tended towards depression on his best days, he likely lived with a mental condition like bipolar disorder, did not respond well to the incursion, and he retreated to his castle in Prague where he lived as a recluse. His family convinced his twin brother, Matthias, to act on Rudolf's behalf by making peace with the Hungarian and Transylvanian Protestants and with the Turks. This Peace of Vienna guaranteed religious freedom in Hungary, and as a result of this success, Matthias was recognized as head of the Habsburg clan and as Rudolf's heir. Most everyone was pleased with the Peace of Vienna, except for Rudolf, who resented his brother's success. Rudolf denounced all of his brothers for their role in accommodating the Turks and the Protestants. He tried to minimize Matthias's newfound influence. Angered, Matthias then allied with the Protestant Hungarian nobles and marched against Rudolf, who surrendered. Defeated, Rudolf ceded Hungary, Austria, and Moravia to Matthias in 1608, and then ceded Bohemia in 1611. Rudolf was also forced to sign a Letter of Majesty in 1609 that granted Bohemians the right to choose as individuals, not as cities or as states, between Catholicism, Lutheranism, and one of two groups of Hussites. The Hussites were disciples of Jan Hus, the Bohemian reformer who'd been burnt at the stake in 1415 for heresy. In 1609, the same year as the Peace of Vienna, Catholic German princes organized a Catholic League headed by Maximilian of Bavaria. This was meant as a counter to the Protestant Union. Matthias, who'd become Holy Roman Emperor in 1612, wanted to make the Catholic League an institution of Habsburg will. He hoped to woo Lutherans from the Protestant Union, which was dominated by Calvinists. However, Matthias's obsession with Habsburg dynastic ambitions and his history of having fought with Protestant Dutch peasants against Catholic Spain, and his tolerance of Lutheranism, cost him the confidence of some Catholic princes. Upon Matthias's death in 1619, since Matthias had no heirs, the Habsburg lands went to his nephew, Ferdinand, who was already the king of Hungary and Bohemia. The electors duly chose Ferdinand as the new Holy Roman Emperor. Unlike his uncles and his grandfather, for whom he'd been named, Ferdinand II was a very devout Catholic, and he was determined to launch a war of religion against the Protestants in his own kingdoms. While Ferdinand, backed by many nobles, imposed significant limitations on Protestant worship in Bohemia. In Prague, Calvinists and Lutherans began to look outside of Bohemia for potential support. Protestant leaders convoked an assembly of the estates of Bohemia, but Ferdinand ordered that assembly to disband. In 1618, a group of Protestant nobles arrested two Catholic imperial governors and then threw these two and their scribe out of a window. The men did survive. They landed in a pile of manure. But this event, which comes to be known as the Defenestration of Prague, emboldened Protestant leaders to establish a provisional government in Bohemia. It was that last action, the creating of a provisional government, which prompted the beginning of the 30 Years' War. Bohemia rose up in full revolt against both the Catholic Church and the Habsburg dynasty. The rebels turned to the Protestant Union, promising the Bohemian crown to Frederick, the Calvinist elector of the Palatinate, a state northwest of Bohemia, and the most important Protestant prince in Central Europe. Frederick accepted the crown in 1619. When Ferdinand II learned that the Bohemian throne had been offered to Frederick, he was furious. He was the king of Bohemia, and, lacking an army, he turned to Spain for help. Ferdinand's cousin, Philip III, agreed to send troops, which made Spain vulnerable militarily. The price of this aid was steep. Spain wanted to annex the Lower Palatinate, which bordered northeastern France. Maximilian I of Bavaria also sent an army. In the meantime, Protestant armies marched on Vienna and laid siege to it. Catholic armies lifted this siege in 1619, but this news reached Philip III too late. His armies had already been dispatched, which meant that the small crisis in Bohemia had now become an international affair. During a short-lived truce, the Catholic League raised a largely Bavarian army led by Count Johannes von Tilly of Flanders. He managed to subdue Upper Austria and defeated the Protestant Union Army in November of 1620. As Catholic forces now controlled Bohemia, Tilly's army overran Silesia, Moravia, Austria, and part of the Upper Palatine. Frederick of the Palatinate fought on, counting on help from Catholic France and from other states, both Protestant and Catholic, who feared the expansion of Habsburg power. However, Tilly's victory over a Protestant army in 1623 and Tilly's conquest of most of the Palatinate forced Frederick to abandon his claims to Bohemia's throne. Nonetheless, Frederick still hoped for aid, and instead of turning to England, he turned to Scandinavia for help. Christian IV, a Protestant king of Denmark, had ambition and money, and, as he was also the Duke of the northern German state of Holstein, he wanted to extend his influence over the northern German states. In 1625, Christian IV led his army into the northern German states, confident that the English and the Dutch, perhaps even the French, would rush to follow his leadership against the Habsburgs. However, this wasn't to be. James I of England had just died, and his son, Charles I, was beset by problems with Parliament. Louis XIII of France, the son of Henry IV, provided the Danes with only a modest subsidy, and the Dutch sent some money and a few thousand soldiers, but not enough. Christian was unaware that a large imperial army was heading towards him. Albert Wallenstein was the commander of that imperial army. A Bohemian noble who'd been raised a Lutheran, Wallenstein had converted to Catholicism at the age of 20 and had become the most powerful of the Catholic generals. A student of astrology, he was ambitious, ruthless, and possessed of a violent temper. He hated all sorts of background noise. It was rumored that he sometimes ordered all dogs and cats killed upon arriving in a town because he hated barking and meowing. He did often forbid his soldiers and the townspeople from wearing heavy boots or spurs because he disliked the sounds they made. Wallenstein, at the head of this mercenary army, was heading north to help Tilly deal with the Danes. In 1626, Tilly's army, aided by some of Wallenstein's troops, defeated the Danes. The Catholic army then marched into Denmark, devastating Jutland. However, the viciousness of Wallenstein's troops, which ravaged Catholic and Protestant areas alike, engendered opposition within those northern German states. Christian IV, who nearly bankrupted himself to fight the war, signed a peace treaty, the Treaty of Lubeck, in 1629, through which he withdrew from the war and gave up his claims in northern Germany. Ferdinand II's victory over the Danes led him to impose limitations on Protestants without bothering to convoke the Diet. In Bohemia, he forced exile on those who refused to convert to Catholicism and, through the transfer of the Palatinate to his ally, Maximilian of Bavaria, he assured that the majority of the empire's electors were Catholic. Ferdinand, however, found that it was difficult to impose Catholicism in areas where that religion hadn't been practiced in decades. In 1629, the Edict of Restitution allowed Lutherans, but not Calvinists, to practice their religion in certain cities. However, As the edict allowed rulers to enforce the practice of their religions within their territories, the war continued. In the meantime, England, the Dutch Republic, the northern German states of Brandenburg had asked Lutheran King Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden to intervene on the Protestants' behalf. Known as the Lion of the North, Adolphus had survived a shipwreck at the age of 5, and he'd been tutored in the art of war by mercenaries. He played the flute, wrote poetry, and could converse in 10 languages. Both his courage and his violent temper were legendary. He was notable for continuing to fight even when his horse had been shot out from under him. At the same time, he'd been known to drag a thief by the ear to the executioner. Influenced by traditional Roman military tactics, Adolphus thinned out the size of his battle lines, which allowed said lines to be more spread out. He focused on acquiring superior artillery as well, which gave him a technological advantage against the Holy Roman Empire. With an army of about 70,000, Adolphus subdued Catholic Poland and then defeated a combined Polish-Habsburg army, after which he settled his troops in Pomerania, a northern German territory that bordered the Baltic Sea. In 1630, certain of the results and eager to ensure succession of his son, Ferdinand II convoked the electors to recognize his son as the heir to the Holy Roman Empire. However, the electors of Saxony and Brandenburg, both Protestants, refused to attend the meeting, and Catholic electors demanded that Wallenstein be removed before they'd vote, a concession which Ferdinand made so as to ensure the succession of his son. Now, despite French support, Adolphus actually enjoyed the support of only a few tiny German Protestant states. Some Lutheran rulers, hoping to receive concessions from the Habsburgs, had remained loyal to the Holy Roman Empire. Ferdinand pressed that advantage, sending Tilly north to besiege the Protestant city of Magdeburg in Brandenburg. The subsequent surrender of that city and the massacre which followed became a matter of legend, and it prompted Protestant Brandenburg and Protestant Saxony to side with Sweden against the Holy Roman Empire. When 1631, Adolphus's forces defeated Tilly's army near Leipzig and then swept across northern Germany, reversing the Habsburg gains of the past 12 years. The expansion of Swedish power generated anxiety among both Protestants and Catholics, who now worried that Adolphus was building a Swedish empire. In Bavaria, the Swedes once again defeated Tilly's army in 1632, and Tilly himself died in the battle. It seemed as though the Protestants were about to defeat the Holy Roman Empire. In April of that year, however, Ferdinand asked Wallenstein to return and to save the Catholic cause. Wallenstein reconquered Silesia and Bohemia. Adolphus then gathered the largest army that had ever been under a single command in Europe, about 175,000 men, and he marched against Wallenstein. Rather than wait out the winter of 1632, as was traditional for 17th century warfare, Adolphus chose to attack Wallenstein in Saxony that winter. The two sides fought to a draw, but any draw at this point was a Catholic victory. Worse news for the Protestant cause: Adolphus was killed in battle, shot in the arm, back, and head. As it turned out, though, Wallenstein's days were also numbered. After the battle, it became public knowledge that Wallenstein had considered joining Adolphus's army after the way he'd been treated during the vote for Ferdinand's heir, and that he'd essentially been offering his services to both France and Protestant German states. Infuriated at this betrayal, Ferdinand again dismissed Wallenstein, and this time ordered his assassination. In February of 1634, an Irish mercenary crept into Wallenstein's room, speared him, and wrapped his body in a rug before hauling it down the stairs for all to see. With the remnants of Wallenstein's army, the Spanish army defeated a combined Swedish-German Protestant army in 1634 in Swabia. The Elector of Saxony made peace with Ferdinand in 1635, and one by one, the other German Protestant princes left the war. By 1635, what had begun as a religious war had become more of a dynastic struggle between two Catholic states, Bourbon France, allied with Protestant Sweden, and Habsburg Austria, allied with Spain. In 1635, France declared war on Philip IV of Spain, hoping to force the Spanish armies away from the French borders. France then invaded the Netherlands, which was revolting against Spain, and the southern German states, but these incursions did not go well. Instead, Louis XIII's France began to overextend itself. By 1636, there were already calls for peace. The Pope called for a peace conference to be held in Cologne. Unfortunately, no one showed up. By the 1640s, the people of the individual states began to lobby for peace. Among the great powers, only Louis XIII wanted the war to continue. He subsidized the invasion of Hungary by Transylvanian Protestants, but as Swedish and Transylvanian forces marched on Vienna, Ferdinand III, Holy Roman Emperor who'd succeeded his father, concluded a peace treaty with the Prince of Transylvania. Ferdinand III also agreed to tolerate Protestants in Hungary and came to the realization that any peace would have to be far-reaching and would have to include amnesty for those princes who'd fought against the Habsburgs. Preliminaries for peace agreements began in 1643 and dragged on through 1648, even as sporadic fighting continued throughout the empire. The Treaty or Peace of Westphalia in 1648 was a document that, because of the nature of the 30 Years' War, had to incorporate a multitude of international powers. Nearly 200 heads of state were involved in its creation and in its completion, a variety of agreements that were handed out. In actuality, the Treaty, or Peace of Westphalia, is a combination of 3 different agreements, all ratified in 1648 between various heads of state. Negotiations toward peace had begun in 1641 but petered out, and then began anew in 1644, primarily under French cardinal and government official Cardinal Mazarin, who feared continued chaos, particularly for France, should the war drag on. He believed he might negotiate a better end for France the sooner the war ended. And he was right. Negotiations were conducted in 2 cities, Münster, a Catholic city, and Osnabrück, a free city, thanks to the Peace of Augsburg, with a Lutheran majority, but one in which Catholics had freedom of worship. Generally speaking, Catholic aggressors hammered out their differences in Münster, while Protestant aggressors did so in Osnabrück. In May of 1648, the Kingdom of Spain, one of the Holy Roman Empire's main allies, and the Dutch Republic agreed to the recognition of Dutch independence from Spain. The Dutch had been fighting the Spanish for independence for 80 years. Hereafter, the provinces of the Dutch Republic were free from Spanish influence. In October of 1648, the provisions of the treaties of Münster and Osnabrück were consolidated into a single document with 128 articles that addressed religious and political principles as well as territorial shifts. Territorially, France made out well, essentially granted the territory of Alsace-Lorraine. Sweden maintained its territorial integrity and was granted an indemnity so as to pay its troops. The Swiss Confederacy was formally recognized as independent from Austria and the Holy Roman Empire in Article 63, although it had essentially been so for centuries. Religiously, all parties recognized the main principle of the Peace of Augsburg, cuius regio, eius religio, and added a legal recognition of Calvinism. In effect, this rescinded the Edict of Restitution of 1629. Further, in Article 28, all parties recognized that individuals had the right to practice their faith even if their faith was not the established church of the territory in which they lived. States agreed to outline when those individuals could practice their faith, specified days, times, and places for worship. Politically, the peace recognized what is now referred to as Westphalian sovereignty, the idea that each nation-state has sovereignty over its territory and domestic affairs to the exclusion of all external powers. In other words, there was to be a respect for each state's territorial integrity. Also, there was to be respect for each state's political self-determination. When determining territorial shifts, the negotiators also, in effect, endorsed the concept of the balance of power, although that particular phrase wouldn't be used in writing until 1713. This meant a commitment to ensuring no one state could easily dominate all others. It was a way to maintain both national security and Westphalian sovereignty. So, if we consider the Peace of Westphalia to be the end of the Reformation era, then it also makes sense to say that it was the beginning of an era in which individual states, which might be a part of huge empires but might not, were actors on the diplomatic stage. The shift toward the nation-state, which had begun at the twilight of the Middle Ages, was finally complete.